Impeachment is gone like the wind, and you bet your ass we're talking about it. We recap impeachment from start to finish and look at the effects it's going to have moving forward. I'm Justin Sharp, and you're listening to the Sharp Side of the World. So, here on the Sharp Side of the World, we're running on a pretty tight budget to produce the best content possible. We're talking about a $30 USB microphone on a $20 boom arm, all running into GarageBand on my MacBook Air. So if you want to help out and make yourself some cash by advertising, do it on the podcast. If you want to place an advertisement on the Sharp Side of the World, email me at nitsuj2203@gmail.com. That is nitsuj2203@gmail.com. DM me on Instagram at razor_sharp2203, or message me on Facebook at Justin Sharp. Also, I just got into the Twitter world, so if you want to go follow me over there, the tag is at razor_sharp2203, just like my Instagram tag. Alrighty, so let's dive right into today's topic. Impeachment time for the impeachment timeline. Today's episode is all about the timeline of impeachment and how we got to be where we are currently. If you want an impeachment summary, not a 3-hour long breakdown, just keep listening and I'm going to clear everything up for you. The story of impeachment debacle actually starts all the way back in 2014 when Russia decided they wanted to invade Ukraine, and they eventually annexed Crimea, which is a little peninsula off of Ukraine that is now Russian territory. On the world stage, this was a pretty aggressive move by the Russian government, and it made them look like a 1940s gangster imperial empire, just the way they started grabbing land. It does really highlight how much of a danger Vladimir Putin is in the Russian leading office, but that's a topic for another day, so we might get to that at a later date. So now that Russia is openly invading other countries, the world immediately became pretty frightened. Obviously, NATO was actually invented for situations like this, if what would have been the Soviet Union invaded a Western country, but Ukraine was not a member of NATO, obviously, and Russia did stop pretty short of where they could have gone. After the annexation of Crimea, the United States and others had a large interest in backing up Ukraine politically and militarily against the Russian government as to counter Russian aggression. There's, of course, one massive problem laying right in the way for the United States and others, though, and that is that Ukraine had one of the most corrupt governments on the planet. An example of this corruption was in a top prosecutor named Viktor Shokin, who was literally known in the EU and UN for being a corrupt official, and this guy becomes pretty important as impeachment goes on. So Viktor Shokin wasn't on the U.S.'s radar for any specific reason, except we did know that he was pretty corrupt, until Joe Biden on December 8th of 2015 asked for Shokin to be fired, that is. I'm pretty sure he asked the president of Ukraine to fire him. So he said if Shokin wasn't fired, then he was going to hold up $1 billion of loan aid that would support the Ukrainian government. So where this gets a little spicy is that Viktor Shokin at the time was leading a pretty prominent investigation into Hunter Biden, who was none other than the son of Joe Biden. And Hunter Biden was on the board of this Ukrainian gas company, which is why he was being investigated. Now, right now, it's pretty fair to go ahead and acknowledge that Hunter Biden is no saint and uses daddy's name to get a lot of money. After Biden struggled to get by in Washington after a few years of law school, he enlisted in the Navy at 44, which is a little odd, just to be kicked out after he tested positive for cocaine. He then tragically was caught buying crack from homeless people in New York off the streets after his brother's death, which is pretty sad actually, and after that he managed to find his way into the board of Burisma, which was the largest gas company in Ukraine. And like I said, he was getting paid exorbitant amount of money, millions of dollars per year, just for his last name because this guy had no experience in oil nor business. So on December 8th, like I said, 2015, Joe Biden asked Ukrainian officials to fire Viktor Shokin, who was in the middle of an investigation into his son Hunter. This event is what directly caused this whole impeachment debacle to be culminated in association with Trump's huge mouth, like a lot of things. So when Biden asked Shokin to be fired, it could have either been to get rid of the corrupt Ukrainian government, which is pretty plausible because he was the head of Ukrainian affairs, or it could have been to get his son out of potential trouble, which is very corrupt. Trump's whole pitch for investigations in Ukraine, as we will see, is about what the Biden's dealings in Ukraine were, and this event brought a lot of attention to that. There's a fair argument that says Joe Biden was asking for Shokin to be fired with fair intentions. Like I said, at the time, the United States desperately, and still desperately, needs the fairest possible government in Ukraine as to stay strong against the Russians. The Obama administration actually took a lot of steps to oust this corruption. They sent over FBI officials, Justice Department officials, State Department officials, all in an attempt to form an anti-corruption agency inside the government, which would make it look like Joe Biden was trying to have an anti-corruption agenda when he asked this. But there's also a fair argument that Senate Republicans have adopted, mainly Ted Cruz, who says there is a possibility of corrupt intent with Joe Biden's questioning. This argument mainly points out how corrupt Burisma is, which is the company that Hunter Biden was on, and how Hunter Biden's involvement may have sparked Joe Biden to try and bail him out. This argument points out that Burisma as a company was founded blatantly on corruption in the government. The owner, I'm going to botch this name, Mykola Zlochevsky, I think I actually did pretty good on that, was the Minister of Natural Resources and grew his company by giving licenses to his own company, Burisma. Hunter Biden then got onto the board of this very corrupt company, we think through one of his kind of associates or one of his friends who was also on the board. And by the time its company and its affiliates were being investigated, it's very likely that Joe Biden just wanted his son out of there because he didn't know what was going to happen. So on its own, the fact that an American citizen is on one of the most corrupt companies in Ukraine and the world, which the United States was trying to fix, that's a very investigatable thing, in my opinion. Especially when there is as big of a conflict of interest between the vice president of the United States and that citizen. So it seems a little fishy, but I don't know. So on March 29th, 2016, about 2.5 months after Joe Biden asked for Shokin to be fired, he got fired. This is probably going to happen anyway, just because Ukraine actually did need quite a bit of help on the world stage, and they wanted to get rid of the corruption if they had to get that help. But Biden made it look even worse for himself when he said this.
And so I got Ukraine. And I remember going over convincing our team, or others, to convincing us that we should be providing for loan guarantees. And I went over, I guess, the 12th, 13th time to Kyiv, and I was supposed to announce that there was another $1 billion loan guarantee. And I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. So they said they were walking out to press conference. I said, "No," I said, we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, "You have no authority. You're not the president." The president said. I said, "Call him." I said, "I'm telling you, you're not getting the $1 billion." I said, "You're not getting the $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here." And I think it was 6 hours. I looked. I said, "I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money." Well, son of a bitch. Got fired. And they put in place someone who was solid.
If you didn't hear that correctly, yes, he was openly bragging about getting the prosecutor fired. He said something along the line of this, "Well, son of a bitch, they fired the guy." This is almost Trump levels of making yourself look bad. I mean, my God, if politicians could make themselves look innocent, it'd be the day that hell freezes over. So let's move on to April of 2016, that is, and Ukraine started to get involved in the election. In late March, early April of 2016, the Ukrainians started releasing dirt on the Trump campaign chair, Paul Manafort, who had ties to ex-Ukrainian oligarchs and leaders. They said he did business and took money from the ex-president of Ukraine, who had to flee to Russia, fleeing his own country, who was mad about corruption. And the Trump campaign on April 19th fired Paul Manafort for pretty obvious reasons. He was pretty bad optics for them, which then caused Trump to get an idea in his head about Ukraine and corruption. And when Trump gets one of these ideas, one of these wild hair ideas in his head, we all know what happens. It comes out at some point. More often than not, it causes him a fair bit of trouble on Twitter. And this idea eventually formulated into a belief in the conspiracy theory where Ukraine was actually the ones behind election interference, which was done by Russia. This was not true and never proven to be true, but like I said, it was one of those ideas in Trump's head. Later on, after Trump ended up winning the election, he became a very pro-Ukrainian aid president, which is part of what made him look good in the Mueller probe because he actually was defending Ukraine against Russia, but that is also a topic for another day. Over the last 3 years, the Trump administration had given hundreds of millions of dollars of military aid to Ukraine, along with directly giving them lethal weapons to Ukraine to strengthen their military against Russian aggression. Some of this aid was directly involved in the impeachment scandal, as I will get to in a minute. So while all of these events were unfolding, Rudy Giuliani, good old Rudy Giuliani, the ex-mayor of New York and now Trump's personal attorney, was running around Ukraine trying to find out exactly what happened with Hunter Biden and the Bidens in general in Ukraine. Out of all the questions raised in the impeachment, I believe that the question of what Rudy Giuliani was doing in Ukraine is actually one of the biggest ones that hasn't quite been answered. It is unclear if Rudy was running around for Trump or the State Department, but we do know that he was in Ukraine, and he says that he dug up some dirt on all of the Biden stuff, even though he hasn't released it yet, which is kind of odd. There's a pretty famous line. I believe he was on CNN, and he's just in the middle of this interview. And the CNN, I almost think it was Chris Cuomo. He's like, so why are we in Ukraine? And he holds up his phone, and he's like, I have text from the State Department on my phone. And it's, this guy. Like I said, prominent people in politics making themselves look innocent, not a thing. So I've got to say, though, another point that's kind of funny on this. What is it with Trump and lawyers? This guy goes from Michael Cohen, who was a criminal and taped Trump in a meeting, did some pretty shady stuff behind his back. And then he hires Rudy Giuliani for a defense lawyer against the Mueller probe and other stuff that would have came up. Who goes on, he never misses a chance to go on CNN or one of these other liberal news networks and just can't shut up. I mean, I understand going on there and get riled, but when you go on and say stupid stuff while arguing with Block of Wood Chris Cuomo, it's a little ridiculous. So on April 21st, Vladimir Zelensky was hired to be the president of Ukraine, and this is where events started to directly lead up to the impeachment charges. As typical, most new foreign leaders, the president tries to talk to them as soon as possible to make plans for the future, or just to get warm with them as they rise up on the world stage. The phone call that Trump had with Zelensky was really what got him into hot water, but we'll get to that in a minute also. Around the same time that Zelensky won the election, Joe Biden also declared that he was running for another election, the Democratic primary, in the presidential race. So as per usual, Trump had to unleash the Twitter beast in his head and go pound town on Joe Biden. We're talking tweets about how Biden is sleepy. We're talking about tweets how Hunter Biden is corrupt, and interviews where he said all the same things. The full internet troll that is Donald Trump was let off the leash to attack Joe Biden in late April, as we probably all saw. So one large point to note here is that between Zelensky's election and the phone call that got Trump in trouble, which was a pretty long stretch of time, a couple months, administration staff and advisors were talking about getting an investigation into Burisma and Biden with Ukraine for anti-corruption efforts. It wasn't just Trump thinking about getting Biden, it was also his advisors, which kind of makes Trump look a little more innocent in all this. So now we arrive at impeachment event number uno. Trump puts a hold on $250 million of military aid to Ukraine, kicking off what would become known as the quid pro quo, or an exchange between two parties to benefit both of them. As we will see, this event made up the entire argument for Democrats in the impeachment inquiry trial. A couple of quick facts about this holding of $250 million of military aid. One, the Ukrainians didn't know it was being held up. They knew they had aid coming, but they didn't know the amount or it was being held up, which kind of seems like a crappy quid pro quo. And also there was a point somewhere where I don't remember what the report was, but basically it made it look like this was kind of routine. Like usually there's just a little bit of hold on it, but this ended up being longer than a little bit of hold. So that's a point, but it's also a little less prominent. Fun fact for this next part, I was actually in Washington, D.C. for this, and nothing seemed chaotic because it didn't come out until a couple months later, but I was in D.C. for this. So July 25th is where the deed was done, and Trump finished the second half of the quid pro quo. On a phone call with Zelensky, Trump made mention of investigations into the Bidens and Burisma, but he didn't make clear of why he wanted the investigations, and he definitely didn't talk about the military aid, which is where the impeachment charges fell short because they couldn't say that it was bribery or anything like that. From here, things really went downhill for the president for a couple weeks. You could probably argue that it was the worst weeks of his presidency. A CIA whistleblower who was in the call reported that President Trump said all this, and he reported him to the Inspector General of the intelligence community in a whistleblower report. And then the report was submitted to Congress because the Inspector General found it to be urgent. And then the story just blew up in America's face, as most things do. The Trump administration quickly moved to do what I call covering their asses to make things look a little better than that they were. And Trump, in a very Trumpy fashion, got really loud and defensive, which, like I say, does not make you look innocent, dude. Politicians, I swear. So on September 24th, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, expressed support for an impeachment inquiry, basically guaranteeing that the House would impeach the 45th President of the United States. The House is controlled by Democrats, as most of us know, And Nancy Pelosi is a fairly moderate Democrat who ended up losing control of the House to the radicals in her party. So when she said that, it was definitely obvious that many of them would follow, and that's exactly what happened. After release of the transcript on the call the day after Nancy Pelosi made this announcement, there were numerous testimonies from people like Bill Taylor, Gordon Sondland, and others who were close to the events in July on the phone call. On December 18th, Trump was formally impeached in the House, being only the third president to do so in history, which I don't think the impeachment was necessarily monumental because it wasn't it wasn't a question of illegality more so as there was wrongdoing. But the thing that did make this a little unnerving is the first impeachment was Andrew Johnson back right after the Civil War in Reconstruction. And then it took another, 130 years to get to Bill Clinton. And then it took only 20 more years to get to Donald Trump, which is a little unnerving just because we're starting to see more and more impeachments because the country is being more and more divided. But we talked about that last episode if you want to go listen to more of that. So here's where things get really, really stupid. The House impeached under 2 articles: obstruction of Congress and abuse of power. As the listeners may recognize, neither of these are legal statutes. And now let's read from the Constitution. Article 2, Section 4 says, quote, "The President, Vice President, and civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors," unquote. The House impeached Trump under no such charges, which is technically constitutional because impeachment is not a legal process. It is a political process, but it sets a very bad precedent for what impeachment is and what it should be used for because it's not something that needs to be used on every president. The founders did not intend for impeachment like this to be completely partisan and for things that the opposing party just didn't like to be impeachable. Until January 15th, the Senate didn't receive the articles because Nancy Pelosi held them, trying to persuade the Senate to have a more fair trial. But we all knew already that the Republican Senate would not convict the president. There was no way that about half of the Republican majority would turn and vote to convict the president to get the 2/3 vote that it needed. So once the trial started, things moved pretty fast. Within just a few days, the procedure setting, then about a week more of hearings from the House impeachment managers and defense lawyers. So House impeachment managers argued that the president used his power to take out a political rival, but they couldn't really prove what they needed to because Trump may have just been trying to oust corruption in Ukraine, like past presidents did, or it could have just been one of these little thoughts in Trump's head about Ukrainian corruption, running around trying to see what was happening over there. They also said that he obstructed Congress by not allowing witnesses, but that isn't a crime. The Constitution designed this to be a check on the legislature. If the House really wanted more witnesses in their inquiry, they could have just gotten a court's approval and had a binding subpoena for John Bolton or whoever else they wanted, and then they would have had to testify. Defense lawyers argued that it was totally within the rights of the president to investigate corruption, even if it is tied to a political opponent, which is pretty fair, although that is a pretty fine line you'd be walking if you were president and did that, and that the president was not granted a defense in the House inquiry, so he was treated unfairly, which is kind of true, although I think this is the weaker of the two arguments. Trump didn't get to have any defense witnesses in the House inquiry, but like I say, this doesn't really matter that much. Midway through this impeachment trial, John Bolton's book was mentioned because it was submitted to the White House. It was mentioned of a bombshell in it, but this basically amounted to nothing so far. I'm kind of afraid it will later, but I'll get to that in a minute. So Republicans narrowly defeated Democrats in a vote to hold no further witnesses in the trial, which I think is a very risky move related to John Bolton's book, and like I said, I'll explain that later. The Senate voted 52-48 to acquit the president, as we all expected. The impeachment is now over, thank God, and as far as I can see, it won't really affect anything too majorly in the future, as things are now, besides making the country even more divided than it already is, which I talked about extensively in the last podcast, if you want to listen to that. So, Americans don't give a damn about any of this because, quite frankly, we all knew the outcomes before it started. And it was way too partisan. When Nancy Pelosi said that she supported an inquiry, well, we all went, Trump's out in the House. When the articles of impeachment passed in the House, we all said, well, Senate's not going to acquit him. So if anything, the Democrats in the House are going to be hurt by this because they seemed really vicious, especially after the State of the Union. They seemed really vicious, and to make the article of impeachment with no crimes, it's just very unattractive. There's a pretty big gamble for the Senate Republicans, though, and I believe it could lead to a doomsday scenario if all the puzzle pieces fell in right, which hopefully is very unlikely. So let's think about this. If John Bolton, who has no love lost for Trump, he got fired by Trump. He used to be, I think, a national security advisor. If he were to drop the bombshell that he was rumored to have 2 weeks before the general election in October, then that could have, and if this evidence would have impeached Trump if it would have been put in the trial, Trump may very well lose because Democrats are going to cry illegitimacy, and Trump's not going to have a good defense because he's going to know he's screwed. And now let's think about the Democratic race. Through all the Iowa problems, which I will talk about in the next episode, even though the elections have slowed down a little bit, Bernie Sanders, a communist, is very likely to be the opposition in the general election. Let's just let that sink in for a second. So if something comes out damning Trump, then we could very easily have our first socialist communist president, which is basically a doomsday scenario, especially if the House and Senate turn blue. And think of all the chaos that's going to cause, just because they didn't hold witnesses in the Republican trial. And all along, I was actually a supporter of witnesses because I thought that the American people need to know as much as possible. And I understand the political scene in this. It looks like bad optics for Trump to be in the middle of a trial this whole time. But honestly, I don't think any witnesses would have said much else different from what we already heard. So I think we probably could have had witnesses and got away with it. But in general, the impeachment just showed how divided we are as a country. If Trump wins the upcoming election, there's going to be even more calls of illegitimacy because he's been impeached in the House. And if he loses, like I say, we could have a communist president. But either way, impeachment in a partisan fashion, that in the way it has been pushed, it's pushed the country even further along party lines, and that is definitely not in a good direction. If you want to hear more about my thoughts on the division of the country, listen to the last podcast episode, because that's what the topic was, the death of American politics. So, all right, so we're sitting at about 21 minutes right now, so we're going to go ahead and skip the media story of the day, because that was a lot to unpack, honestly. But thanks for listening. Subscribe to the podcast. Find me on Facebook at Justin Sharp, Instagram at Razor_Sharp2203, that's Razor with an O, and TikTok at Justin Sharp 43. If you're looking for a place to advertise, like I said, we're running on a tight budget. Email me at nitsuj, that's nitsuj, my name backwards, 2203@gmail.com, or contact me on any of the social media accounts I just mentioned. Thanks for listening, and I will talk to you next week.